Well, hey, everybody. It's good to see you. Good to see our church. Well, I can't really see you at home, but we know you're joining us, and we know more and more people are joining us online with numbers going up. People are choosing that as a safer place. And so if that's you, we're glad to join you in your home. Now, each weekend that we do this, we try to kind of pretend that we're coming to you live Sunday morning when we're actually videotaping it Saturday night. So I can't say what I want to say next and kind of fake you out. So this morning, Saturday morning, our first volunteers arrived on this campus at 4:30 in the morning to prepare this campus for 500 people, runners and hikers from our community, to hike the Four Peaks, run the Four Peaks, whatever they did throughout the day. Months leading up to an event like this, we pray for this one thing: that Jesus would let his presence be known through the way we love our community in practical kinds of ways. I know it's kind of an athletic thing, but it's not an athletic thing to us. It is about being real people who love our community and invite them to this campus, and there we get to serve them. We get to serve them on the hills and the trails around us. We get to serve them here by providing food for them and checking them in gracious and good ways and taking care of their medical needs that come up. And it was just an incredible event again today, as it is every year. It's the 6th year we've done it. And again and again, we'll have people tell us that there's something just special and different when they walk onto this campus. And we know what it is, even if they may not know. We know that that is the presence of Jesus. I met one of our volunteers that volunteered for the very first time this last year. He said, a couple of months ago, I started watching your Mass on TV. And he said, I heard about what you're doing. And I don't come to this church, but I love my community, and could I serve? And so he helped out on campus. And so it's the influence of Jesus in people's lives, and that's what we are so grateful for. So we have a lot of tired volunteers tonight, 150 or so. And so for those of you that volunteered, oh man, I trust that you experienced the personal blessing of Jesus as you are his representative to people in our community. So thank you so much for that. All right, I want to pick up next installment in this series we call the King and His Cross. And this is where Pastor Paul left us last weekend. Jesus had taken a trip to the northwest portion of kind of the Palestinian Israeli area. You can see it on the map right here. And he went there to love some people and to be involved in their lives and to show his love and what life with him could be like. And so he's there for a little while, and then he heads back down into the area of the Decapolis, which is circled right there. This was a league of 10 cities, as Paul mentioned last week, that were all Greek in nature, and they were really skeptical of outside religions coming into their area, because, particularly Jewish people, because over the course of many, many years, a number of attempts had been made by the Jewish nation to secure that territory back in the name of God. And that's not exactly not the most popular people in the world when you've done that a couple of times. And here Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, comes into their area. But here's the wonderful thing that happens. The truth is that hope and love are magnets for us in our world, as they were for the people that lived there. They responded to Jesus being present. And this is what we know happened as a result of Jesus being there. The last verse of Mark 7:37, we're going to read Mark 8:1 on. This is what it says: they were completely amazed and said again and again, everything he does, that's Jesus, is wonderful. He even makes the deaf to hear and gives speech to those who cannot speak. See, love and hope are just magnetic. So this is what we looked at last week, that Jesus went to these areas to take notice, to take interest, and take initiative. And this is exactly what Jesus is doing in this Decapolis area where we're going to pick him up today. That he's taking notice, he's taking interest, and he takes initiative because he knows, as I've said, love and hope in real tangible ways, they're magnets for people. And word gets out. Well, word would get out If somebody with a chronic condition is healed by someone speaking into it, somebody with an acute condition is suddenly has their life back because they've been healed by someone, word gets out. And word gets out in this area. As skeptical as they might be about Jesus, love and hope are magnetic, even if you're skeptical of the source. And this is Jesus' presence and what it does. So let's pick it up in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 to 21. It says, about this time, another large crowd had gathered. See, people are gathering. And people ran out of food again. You can underline again. Yep, again. Does that sound like familiar? If you were here a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Mark chapter 6, this is where Jesus, on his own home turf this time, like northern part of the Sea of Galilee, feeds between 18 and 20,000 people with a little bit of bread and a few fish. You remember that story? It sounds like the same thing again. There's a food shortage, lots of people, they need to be fed, and Jesus is going to step in and do something about it. It's like Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again, right? So Jesus calls his disciples and he told them this, I feel sorry. I feel sorry for these people. Sorry for people. That's the Canadian word is sorry. Okay. The Greek word is this wonderful word that is said splachnizomai. I just like to say it, splachnizomai. You can go around and what does it mean? Well, it's more than he just cared. That's why I draw it out. He's deeply moved by the needs of these people, so much so that he has to do something about it. Many years ago, like 25, 30 years ago, Elfie and I were in Hawaii, and we're walking down the beach along Waikiki, the sidewalk, and suddenly there's this man who's just walking this way, and a couple, she's pregnant, are walking the other way, and he stops in front of her, and he pushes her. And she falls back off the sidewalk where there's a chain link fence, and she falls over it, and she's lying on the ground. I watch this whole thing unfold, and I have to do something. After doing that, the guy walks down the street. So I followed him for a block and a half till I saw a police officer coming down the street. And I ran out into the street. I waved him down. And I explained to him what had just happened, because you can't do that. You have to do something. You have to respond in some way. And Jesus responds because he sees something. This is his nature. This is what he does. He goes on and he says, they have been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. We're going to find out that it's 4,000 people hanging around with Jesus for 3 days. How good a communicator do you have to be to have people hang around with you for 3 days? Some of you are already nodding off now. Like this for 3 days. How captivating was Jesus, right? Well, this is what he does. So verse 3 says, if I send them home hungry, they'll faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance. His disciples replied, we saw you do this one other time, Jesus. This is not a problem for you. This is a piece of cake. You did it like with 18 to 20,000. There's only 4,000 here. We're starting with a little bit more than what we started with there. This is a piece of cake, Jesus. Let's just feed them. You can do this, right? No. They rather say this, how are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness? I think it's so cool that they know exactly what Jesus is thinking without him even saying it. They know that Jesus is going to try to feed that large group, and he's going to turn to them for their help. Doesn't need their help, but again, when Jesus notices, he takes interest and he takes initiative. I want to be part of a church like that. That just is so predictable, like absolutely predictable, that when they see a need, they take personal interest, and then they take initiative, and you can just predict that's what they're going to do. Just like these guys knew Jesus would do that. There was no way that he was going to walk away from these 4,000 people and not feed them. That's a beautiful way to be predictable, isn't it? And they're actually right. Verse 5 says, Jesus asked, how much bread do you have? 7 loaves, they replied. So Jesus told all the people, sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to his disciples, who distributed the bread to the crowd. A few small fish were found, too. So Jesus also blessed these little guys and told the disciples to distribute them. They ate as much as they wanted. Just sit down and do the mathematical calculations of how much food was actually produced. It's interesting to do that. They ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. And no one's surprised that that's how that story ended, it, right? You would have been surprised if it had ended any other way. This is the nature of Jesus. Wouldn't it be great if we could recall this in our own lives, where God does something for us? We ask him to intervene. We ask him to encourage us. We ask him to deliver us from a chaotic, difficult situation, and he does it. So the next time we face something similar, we just expect that's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to do something similar to what he did before. But our memories are not so good. Isn't it true in your life as it is in mine that Jesus can do something grand today and bail me out or help me out or encourage me or provide in some unique way? And then a new crisis comes tomorrow and I forget what he did today, right? This is what happens to these disciples of Jesus, and we can't be too hard on them because this is what they experienced. Verse 9 says, there were about 4,000 men in the crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. So Jesus does this wonderful thing. The reason I tell you that is because it's a setup for something that's about to happen. It's a backdrop for what happens next. Verse 10 says, immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of Dalmanutha. Well, this is a map of where that is. It's just across the fat area of the Sea of Galilee. And when he gets over there, there's a group of people that are waiting for Jesus. Verse 11 says, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had arrived in that area, they came and started to argue with him. They were testing him. They demanded that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. This also sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? We've heard of these guys before. Just like the feeding of the thousands sounds familiar, so does this. This is one of many confrontations that these Pharisees have with Jesus. They come to him and they want something from him. They are critical of what he's doing. They're questioning of who he is. But this time, it's different than others. Previously, the times that they've confronted Jesus, it's around his theology or his religious practice or something that he claims he can do, like forgive sins and that kind of thing. But this time, they up their game. They're actually getting to the heart of the matter of what they're concerned about Jesus. They're questioning Jesus' identity and really his legitimacy. And they want Jesus to do some amazing sign that would prove that he's legit and that he really is the Messiah. You would think, wouldn't you? You would think that healing somebody who has never been able to see, or giving somebody the ability to hear who hadn't been able to hear before, healing a skin disease that could potentially lead to complications and ultimately be a terminal disease, raising someone from death to life, controlling the weather patterns. You'd think that would be enough, wouldn't you? No, it's not enough. It's not enough. They need something more. Here's the interesting thing. It appears that the power of not wanting to believe something turns out to be much more powerful than the desire to believe something. We become biased in our view, and it's really hard because we've gone public with it. These guys have already pushed against Jesus and they've questioned him. And now what's going to change their view? It would be really hard for them to change their view, and they're not about to. So their bias toward Jesus is so strong that even if he does those spectacular things, they still question whether he's worthy of their faith. You see, they don't want Jesus to be divine. And we're going to find out why in just a little bit. And this causes them to interpret the data of what they've seen Jesus do and the experiences with such a strong bias that it's almost as if they can't believe. Not just won't, but they can't. It's like their hearts have become hard to what Jesus has to say. I believe their bias is so strong that they have in their minds the kind of sign that they would want Jesus to demonstrate to them that might be the only thing that would turn around their bias. And this is what we do with Jesus as well. We prescribe for him what it is that he would need to do for us to increase our faith, rather than let our faith be as it is and let Jesus respond accordingly. I have someone like that in my life, someone very close to me. So what was it that they might have been looking for? What kind of sign would do the job? Well, I wonder if maybe they weren't thinking of like a Moses experience, where a bush is talking and burning but doesn't burn up and the voice has got authority to it. Or maybe they were looking for somebody with a staff to tap a rock and drinking water pour out of it. Or maybe a body of water that is spoken to or touched with that same staff suddenly separates and millions of people go. Maybe they were looking for that. Or maybe they were looking for an Elijah kind of sign where a bolt of fire comes from heaven and destroys and consumes an altar with a gift that's been placed on it, and tons of water to keep it from burning up has happened. These are all Old Testament kinds of things. I wonder if these guys were looking back to that and going, now that would convince us. And this is what Jesus responds to their request is. In verse 12, he says, when he heard this, he sighed deeply in his spirit, and he asked the question. Now, this is not a sigh of frustration like you and I might have. It's not a sigh of anger that they don't catch on. The word is actually, he's grieved about something. He's sad about something. Some years ago, a very close friend passed away suddenly. He had a heart attack and lingered for a few days, hung on, and overnight one night, he and his family and myself went to be by his bedside, and he passed away through the middle of the night hours. And we left the hospital and we went to his wife's home. And it was like 6 a.m. and now something like that. We're sitting around a table in her kitchen, and they're not saying anything. It's just quiet. And then she breathed just a really deep sigh from the depths of her heart, and she says, what am I going to do without him? It's that kind of sigh. It's the kind of sigh that Jesus is saying, something's being asked for, something's happening here that it just grieves me to the depth of who I am. And this is what he asks in that. He says, why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, I will not give this generation any such sign. So he gets back in the boat and he left them and he crossed over to the other side of the lake. Why is he grieving? What's going on here? I wonder, as Jesus pulled away from the shoreline to head back to his neighborhood, if he wasn't thinking something along this line. If what I have done and what they have seen thus far is not convincing to them that I am the Messiah that they really long for, not even if trees talk or stone altars burst into consuming fire or rivers part or bread falls down from heaven, the skies ablaze with miraculous events, if that won't be enough to convince you, there must be something deep inside of you that has just never been reached yet, has not been uncovered for this. I wonder if that's what Jesus had in his mind as he began to sail back to his home port of Capernaum. The story takes an interesting, somewhat odd twist when the disciples were told in verse 14, say this, but the disciples had forgotten to buy any bread. They had only one loaf of bread with them in the boat. It doesn't kind of flow with the story. It's kind of an incidental throwaway detail, except it becomes the launching pad for the central idea of this entire passage that Jesus, I think, is trying to bring out. It's almost a sense as if Jesus didn't even maybe notice the lack of bread. He seems out of touch with it in some ways. It's in his response, you kind of get a sense that, what are you talking about bread for? This is what verse 15 says. As they were crossing the lake, Jesus warned them, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And although Jesus may have not noticed the lack of bread that his friends in the boat had become aware of, his response to whatever is going on in the boat triggers something in these disciples that's so interesting. Remember, this is the backdrop for just watching 4,000 people fed with a little bit of bread and a few fish. They realize they haven't brought enough bread with them. In verse 16 it says, at this they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. They picked up from Jesus' comment, I guess, that he was concerned that someone had forgotten bread. I wonder what that conversation was like. I wonder if Bartholomew piped up and said, hey, Matthew, weren't you the guy that's supposed to go down to the market and get the bread here? There's just one loaf of bread, Matthew. It's your fault. To which Matthew might say, well, Judas is so tight with the money, he wouldn't give me any money. I'm tired of picking up the tab for you guys. I pay for it all the time. I'm not paying for it anymore. I'm not doing that. Maybe James says, James is a picky eater. He says, I wonder how long that bread's been in the boat. I'm not having any of that bread. You can just see like the tension in the whole group. Thomas says, I'm not even sure that's bread. Unless I touch it, I'm not going to know that's bread. Or Peter says, okay, guys, like who's the bonehead that forgot to grab the baskets of food on the other side of the lake that we just had? Like, why didn't someone take some of that bread with them? Why do they just have one loaf? It's just it's a crazy juvenile conversation, right? To which we might say, how would you ever miss, based on what just happened on the other side of the shore just hours ago, how is it possible to experience a spectacular thing like happens with the multiplied bread that feeds 4,000? How do you not remember that? Why do you question at this point? There's 13 of them in the boat, one loaf. Surely Jesus could just make that 2, couldn't he? Couldn't he do that? Well, we know a little bit about that too. That happens to us occasionally as well. We miss what Jesus has done, is doing, or can do for us because we're preoccupied with our most recent, current crisis or difficulty, and that's what we focus on. We have struggles with our memory of the things that God's done for us in the past. It's just really easy to be preoccupied and distracted with our immediate hunger and miss the bigger picture, that we're hungry for the presence of the one who's in the boat with them, who can take a little bit of this and make it massive amounts and can meet the needs of people. In my imagination, I see Jesus stinging from the onshore argument with the Pharisees. And watching this conversation unfold, shaking his head, he speaks up, maybe in a tone too soft for the others to hear. So they just pick up the conversation about the bread. It's kind of a facepalm moment, like, how is that possible? Verse 17 goes on to say, Jesus knew what they were saying, so evidently he heard enough of it. And he says, why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you know or understand even yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? You have eyes, but you can't see, guys. You have ears, but you can't hear. Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftover did you pick up afterwards? 12, they said. And when I fed the 4,000 just a few hours ago with 7 loaves, how many large baskets of leftovers did you pick up? 7, they said. Don't you understand yet? He asked them. To which the answer is no. They don't understand. But what is it they don't understand? What is the problem here? Well, this is where verse 15 comes in. I want to go back to that verse where Jesus is telling them what they don't understand, and it's a wonderful, profound thought that Jesus, I think, has. This is what verse 15 of chapter 8 says. As they were crossing the lake, after this conversation with the Pharisees, Jesus warned them, watch out. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. He says, watch out. Beware. This is not just a simple word that would be, hey, like, guys, just want to point something out. Just want you to be aware, like heads up. This is a much more graphic term than that. There is something very, very important in Jesus' mind that he wants to get to them. So this word, beware, it reminds me of a time I think it was about 23 years ago. We were just new to Arizona, and we decided as a family we were going to go up to the Grand Canyon to explore the Grand Canyon for the first time as a family. So we drove up, got to the town site, and we decided to take Hermit Road, which is, you can no longer travel it, you can only take it by bus, but at that time you could take cars. And so we traveled up Hermit Road. This is the road that goes west of the town site along the rim and takes you way out west. And so we got about a mile or two into it, and we get to Hopi Point. Have you been to Hopi Point? It's this cool jut out land that juts right out into the canyon itself. And I think you'll get an idea here. It's a spectacular view. So we pulled the vehicle over, parked, and there weren't any signs that you couldn't go outside the barrier. So without signs, obviously you can go outside the barrier, right? That makes perfect sense. I've got a 13-year-old, 11-year-old, and 9-year-old with me. So you see that little point. We'll put the picture up again. That point way in the distance over there. It's got this fantastic view that's about 1,500 feet straight down, but you have to get on your belly and crawl to the edge and look over the edge. And I did that with my 3 children. It was a fantastic, exhilarating experience. We get up from that, and I hear the air horn of a truck or a bus or something, and I look over, and there's a bus that's parked with tourists, and the driver comes out of the bus and runs to where he is yelling at me. How could you do that with your kids? Don't you know there are sheer winds that come up the face of that and can pull you right into the canyon? How could you possibly do that? What kind of a parent are you? That's what Jesus is saying. He's very concerned about something. There's danger, and I don't want you to fall into that danger, so beware. Beware of yeast. Beware of yeast. It's not really all that scary, is it? Nah, like, what's the deal? Yeast, it's a single cell organism. It's a mold, really, is what it is. It's used for baking, right? It's what gives your baking its character and its texture. I experimented with yeast. I was going to show you an experiment of adding sugar and warm water to this, and it was, going to be this giant volcano of expanding gaseous yeast fermentation thing. Didn't work. But yeast is it's a very common kind of thing, and yet if you put it into water and flour and some sugar, it expands. It goes through the whole thing. So what's the yeast part? What's he talking about? Well, he says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the Herodians. Well, what is that? Well, a little bit of history here that helps this maybe make some sense. In the first century, there were 5 major interest groups, I guess you could call it that were all kind of after the same thing. About 90 years earlier, Roman general Pompey had invaded Israel, or this area of the world, Palestine, under Roman authority, and he had taken hold of it, and he had occupied it in the name of Rome, part of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Campaign. About 20 years later, Pompey is overthrown by Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar now calls himself God, and he is God of this whole empire, and he had a very unique way of subjugating people. Rather than relocating them or enslaving them, he would find a local leader who loved money and loved power, and that person would be in charge of the people group, his own ethnic group. And he finds a guy by the name of Herod to do this. And Herod loves money and he loves power. And as long as Herod can keep the Jews under control, pay the taxes, not be violent, and allow access to all the natural resources, Herod's the guy. And he becomes very powerful and very wealthy. And this is who controls Israel. Well, there's a general sense that the Romans aren't wanted because this is land that God's given to his people. And so there's various groups of people. There's the Zealots, which were rebellious revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow Rome. That's one of the groups. Another group was the Essenes that lived in caves in and around the Dead Sea area, and they removed themselves from the culture. They wanted nothing to do with Rome. They just wanted to be their own group of people. There were the Sadducees, who were the kind of the religious elite. They were mostly the priests and the academics, and they said, just go do your thing. As long as you don't interrupt our ability to practice our religious ceremony, we don't care if the Romans are here. We wish they were gone, but just don't interrupt us. But the 2 groups that Jesus mentions are the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees were people who took this law of God really, really strictly because they had concluded the reason the Romans overruled Israel was because they had been unfaithful to God's law. And if they would be faithful to meticulously follow God's law, God would shine on them and be favorable to them, and he would expel the Romans. That was their whole idea. The Herodians, we know, cooperated with Caesar, right? And there were people that would follow Herod and go, if I can ride his coattails to wealth and power, that's what I'm going to do. So they were favorable to Herod as long as Herod liked them. So you have these 2 groups that Jesus points out, and he says, there's something wrong in the way that they're thinking that bothers me deeply, and I want to warn you about what is going on and what bothers me about them. So the danger is that there's something inside of the Herodians and the Pharisees that Jesus wants to speak to them about. What is it? Well, It was that they had both substituted a connection and a personal connection to God with something else. One group was going to follow the rules, follow the law, the religious law that was necessary, and that's what they were going to do to try to win God's favor. The other group just joined in with culture. They couldn't distinguish them from anybody else because they weren't sure God was involved anymore. And so they just cooperated with the culture and the society around. And he turns to his friends in the boat and he says, I am deeply concerned that you will live your lives in one of those two ways. That you'll either become religious and morally upstanding and you'll become judgmental and you'll do what the Pharisees do when that's how you want to relate to God, just by following the law and good behavior. I'm concerned, guys, that you're going to lose the influence of who I am and my compassion and my goodness and my love for this world if that's how you're going to approach the world. I'm telling you, I'm deeply concerned that that's going to get into your life and that's how you're going to live life. Or I'm also concerned you're going to become like the Herodians who just join along with culture and society. And you think God's not really involved. I can kind of follow God, but I really want to do the things that the culture does. I want the pleasures and I want the joys and I want the money and the wealth and the power and those things that go with it. And he says, guys, I am concerned. I'm deeply concerned. Be aware that that does not lead to the life that I want you as my friends to have. I imagine as they're sailing back to Capernaum that they can see the intenseness and intensity that Jesus has, that he wants them to have something else. He wants them to live their lives differently. I wonder if he isn't saying to them, like, if you let those ideas grow in your life, you're going to miss the big idea. And the big idea is this, that I want you to have a truly rich life. In different places, Jesus would say, what does it benefit a human being if they gain the whole world and they forfeit the deeper part of their lives, their souls? Jesus tells us in other places about never being thirsty again. He talks about our souls having living water flowing through them, never being thirsty, or a fountain gushing to eternal life, or a river of living water flowing through us. He talks about us being able to know the love of God that surpasses knowing it. And he is concerned that his friends in the boat with him and us a couple of thousand years later are going to substitute life with his Spirit that flows through us, life in the kingdom. We're going to substitute it for some kind of legalistic religious experience, or we're just going to join in with the culture and not be differentiated from them whatsoever. He's deeply concerned about it, and he honks the horn, the air horn, and says, don't get close to the canyon like that. Don't you know about wind shears that can draw you into the canyon and they'll kill you? He's desperate for his friends to not fall into that. He wants them to be alive and alive in his Spirit. And he says, with the fullness of God. That's what Jesus uses as a term in another place. It's an astonishing vision for humans. It's an astonishing vision that he has for us. Is it your experience? Is that how you experience him? A river, the fullness of God, knowledge that passes knowing? Do you experiencing him of accomplishing abundantly and more than you can dream or envision in your own life? This is what Jesus invites us to not settle for anything less than that. Our life and how we live in this world is a result of who we become in the depths of our being. We live from our heart. Our aim is not to act differently, but to become different in our inner being. And Jesus is concerned that they might just fall into the deceptive trap of the Pharisees and the Herodians and miss the life that he has for them. And he will not let that happen. He will not be okay with that. That's why it says he grieves for them. What is your experience? You see, I think left to ourselves, our default is to lean in that direction of the Pharisees and the Herodians. It's a simpler, more basic, deeper reality that Jesus wants to bring, and that's what he's trying to convince his friends, and we're his friends. He grieves and would say, beware if you find something different than that. In 1998-99, a worship leader by the name of Matt Redman was a pastor in a church in England. And Butch, you can come on up with the team. And they were going through a season of time as a church that there just wasn't kind of the life of Jesus, the living water flowing through them. They weren't anticipating and the wonder of what Jesus could do in them and what he could do for them. And frankly, they were bored with their faith, and they weren't that light on a hill and salt in the world. And they did this really interesting thing. They got rid of all of their sound equipment, all of their musical instruments, and they stripped everything down to just be with Jesus, because what they wanted was they wanted that river of life flowing in them and through them. And the first weekend or two that they did this, without musical instruments and without a sound system, they just sat together in silence till somebody in the room would start to sing a cappella one of the songs that they knew, or a hymn that they knew. In 1999, I think it was, Matt Redman wrote a song, and we're going to sing that song together. And it's about just the simplicity of what Jesus is trying to help his friends grasp and understand and live in. And so, Jesus, even as we sing this and think about this, your concern for us probably hasn't changed from that boat ride back to Capernaum, where you still have that deep concern that we would slip into something less than what you want, into blending in with our culture, or trying to find this kind of religious morality and follow that. But you want something deeper for us. So Jesus, would you now even speak what you have for us individually as we sing this together?